Hello, everybody, and thank you for tuning in to the Liberty Report. With me today is Chris Rosini. And Chris, welcome to the program.
Good morning. Great to be with you, Dr. Paul.
Very good. I want to talk about the wonderful budget that was just passed. Bipartisanship is working as we have predicted. Unfortunately, the bipartisanship is doing things together, Republican and Democrat, but they're going in the wrong direction. That's the only problem that we have. But you know, CNBC reported that this was very important because it avoided a calamity. So they come up and they break the budget, they spend more money, they agree right and left to not worry about deficits anymore. And so that was the calamity, so they avoided that. So guess what? They can go back to spending again. Would you have ever guessed that they would maneuver into that position and then always be dependent on those who can monetize the debt? And of course, the Fed is always there, ready to do it. And right now, they will be welcome to all of the treasury bills that are sent to them. They can just create money out of thin air. So point, once again, bipartisanship, be wary. And also, the old standby, the Federal Reserve, none of this could happen without the Federal Reserve willingness to monetize the debt. Then, of course, the suckers who accept this forever and ever, as long as they obey our empire and that they do what we want, we'll take care of them because we have been licensed to print the money. But of course, our theory is that this can't last forever, and one of these days it's going to break down. It may be the passage of a bill like this might be, something a little bit bolder, admitting that they can't exist without with any restraints at all, and they just turned it loose. And it's just a matter of question: how long is this going to last, Chris?
It's lasted for a while already, Dr. Paul, and they have it down to a science because every day the media directs attention and focus, and Americans still pay attention to the media. It's usually something ridiculous. Republicans fighting against Democrats. I mean, one day the Democrats feel good. Trump said something yesterday. He said the opposite today. It's just zingers back and forth each day. And everybody is so entrenched in this that they can't criticize their own party. But every day it's just all talk. The only thing that matters with politicians is actions, and not even what they say about their actions, their actual actions. And it's always the same in America. Government grows like a weed. And while Republicans and Democrats, they fight with one another, their government is just robbing them blind. And the latest budget just proves that point.
And I think on this bill, it was a little bit more admission out in the opening, admitting the truth. Sometimes they try to hide these things. Oh, but we have sequestering, and we can sequester this, and we'll cut. They were a little bit more blunt. They canceled that out. But probably the one thing that they did that's going to lead more trouble, and they were more honest about, they always avoid the debt limits. But this time, they just suspended it. We're not going to worry about it for 2 years. We'll take care of it in 2 years. So that's their tool of just, kicking it down the road, worry about it later on, but there will be limits, and that's what our job is to predict when that might come and why it's going to come and what we ought to do about it. And of course, that is a job because we have to change the nature of the government, the nature of the people, the demands of the people, and get people to endorse the idea that governments are there, supposed to be there to protect our liberties, not to manage the affairs of the world and then bankrupt the country waiting for that disaster that will eventually come, because this will be unsustainable.
Right, and I challenge anybody, unfortunately I don't have charts on me, but just go to a search engine and look up charts of the government spending, of government debt, of the Fed's money supply. It's all upward over 100 years, not even a break, and it's all done by Republicans and Democrats. It looks like there's two, but it's actually one, and they're taking from all of us. And it erodes our standard of living. They're the biggest government in the history of the world. And you go back to the Declaration of Independence. And, I want to quote Jefferson because he said, "All experience has shown that mankind are more disposed to suffer while evils are sufferable than to right themselves of abolishing the forms of which they're accustomed," which means every year and decade, our standard of living, it just ratchets down and you get used to it. Lower standard of living. Maybe you went to ball games before, and now taking your family to a ball game is, what are you going to spend, $500 to go to a game? So we just get used to it. And now it's up to the debt to just maintain your former lifestyle. You have to go into debt. And this is just a downward spiral until people figure out that it's them against us, and we have to change this stuff.
You know, even the title of the bill was a little bit more admission of what's going on than usual, because they literally called the bill the Bipartisan Act of 2019. Usually it said, because this bill could have passed, the budget bill just passed this week, could have been passed with just the Democrats because they have a large majority. But no, it's this bipartisanship they both want to share in. They both wanted it done. And you know, we say that Pelosi wanted domestic spending, and the Republicans wanted the military spending, and therefore you get half, we get half. But I don't think it's quite that simple. I think Democrats like both, and I think Republicans like both. And they both like the domestic spending and the military spending, because from their viewpoint it's all the same. But there is this pretense, because they're appealing to the base. The liberals have to appeal to, you know, the welfare base and for the poor, and the Republicans have to appeal to the welfare base, the rich, in the military-industrial complex, and spending all this money in militarism. So, but the truth is they all come together because they all believe in interventionism, and when they're fighting and fuming, that's usually the distraction, which we've been putting up with for 2 years, trying to avoid the American people from waking up and saying, my goodness, we're in a mess. We have a messy, dangerous foreign policy on what's going on in the Persian Gulf, and we also have a financial problem to deal with. But nevertheless, don't worry about it. We get along fine. We can pass these budgets, and deficits don't matter anymore. And the whole thing is if we don't get people to realize this, it's going to continue, because there is a demand for spending. The people aren't guiltless on this. They participate in this. But I tell you what, it's been downhill since 1913, because it was in 1913, obviously, because that was when they gave us the income tax, which was a disaster. That was the declaration that they own all our income. We only can spend what we earn by permission of the government. But also it was the Federal Reserve. The Federal Reserve is a taxing authority. It's invisible, it's sinister, it's terrible. They do taxes, and it's just horrible, but there's a limit. They want all this extra spending, but they can't just send a bill to the people and pay for the welfare and the warfare, because that would collapse the system. But it is sinister, and it delays the inevitable. You pass on the cost, you run up the debt, you print the money, the inflation hits one group over another one. But that's one thing that is important that we try to get people to understand, because when they do that, there is a cost, and the cost is not spread evenly. If everybody paid an even amount of penalty from the inflation, it would be quite so bad. But no, there's a group that suffers more than others, and a lot of people make a lot more, the rich versus the poor. And statistically, it shows that the poor people come up short on this. Their wages and their income never goes up like the cost of living. So that's the reason why it seems so strange, and people should wake up. Why is it that somebody who wants to work has 2 or 3 jobs, and they don't have enough money to buy a house, you know, or even pay rent, and they're living on the street? And that has to do with the monetary system. The monster is the Federal Reserve, because they're the facilitator. Without the Fed, we would have none of this. Yes, there would be less booms and busts, and there'd be less super wealthy, but believe me, long term, there'd be more liberty, and there would be a lot more fair and balance in the system, and it wouldn't be rewarding one group over another, and we wouldn't be involved in financing, the welfare state nor the warfare state in a foreign policy, which, as far as I'm concerned, is very dangerous.
Yes, and I want to compliment you. Hit it right on the head, Dr. Paul. Both Republicans and Democrats are both for warfare and welfare. Just think back, we'll just cover the last 2 presidents. You know, when Bush attacked Iraq, the Democrats were actually out in the streets. There were anti-war rallies all the time. Then when President Obama, with a Nobel Peace Prize, comes in and attacks 8 nations, which there's probably a few people in the history of the world that ever did something like that. And Democrats were quiet. And now we have the Republicans. We have a businessman president. He knows how to balance a checkbook. He's in there. And everything, debt, spending is going to astronomical levels, and Republicans are quiet. It's a scam, all of this. You got to break yourself out of it.
You know, and it's a blame game right now. You know, they're trying to figure out who gets blamed for this, sort of like this Russiagate in the election. It had nothing to do with reality or nothing to do with, fairness and law. It had to do with who gets blamed and how can we pin something on somebody else. And this is the way it'll work on this. There is a question now, is who's the next Herbert Hoover, that we can scurry up? Is it going to be Donald Trump or will it be the Democrat? Because they won't ever come around and saying, it's the American people, it's our universities, it's the philosophy that we follow, it's the Keynesians, it's the Federal Reserve, and put it all together. But symbolically, at least, if you look at the monetary system, if you look at the Federal Reserve, if you want to hone in on a real culprit, it was the endorsement of that monetary system along with the taxation and the introduction of the progressive era of 100 years ago. So that is the real problem. So if people are interested in liberty, which seems sometimes in Washington they are not too interested in that, we can't correct this, but this will end. Because if it wouldn't end and we could continue to be the issuer of the reserve currency of the world, none of us as Americans should have to work again, and that would be impossible, obviously. But right now we're king of the hill, and we're able to dictate and tell people what to do, and if they don't obey, we lock them out of the financial markets, we put on sanctions, we punish their civilians and citizens, and claim that we all have to do this because we're humanitarians and we should be taking care of the people. But that's all just a cover for what they are really doing, and that is gaining power over the people and distributing wealth at a rate that is not very fair, and it is not very understanding because it looks like it's all for free. Well, this is not free. There is no such thing as a free lunch. And Chris, I hope we can help prove that eventually everybody has to pay the bill, and we'd like to do that with the least amount of harm and suffering as possible.
That's right, Dr. Paul. I'll finish by saying that everyone on their own, you have to free yourself from this Republican Democrat thing that you see every day. You go to the media and they're telling you this is what we're focusing on today. This is what you're going to be arguing about. You got to free yourself of it. And you know what? We can. There's the internet, and there's a lot of independent media, including us. There's no government licenses where if you say something, they can revoke your license, like on television or on radio. So this is a great opportunity that didn't exist for our ancestors. They were stuck in the pipeline of government schools when you're young, and then you move over to government media when you're older. We don't have to be stuck in that pipeline anymore. You can get out of it, but you have to do it yourself and just turn them off.
Okay, Chris, very good. And I want to also close with summarizing a little bit what I said a few minutes ago, and that is what NBC reported when this bill was passed, that this was avoiding a calamity. And I think they've made the calamity much bigger. It delayed it a little while, and it might last a little bit longer, but the calamity just gets bigger. But we're not going to avoid it because, unfortunately, the bills will have to be paid. So I think that this passing of the bill today is historic. It's a little bit different. It's a little bit of a bigger deal. It went smoothly. It's for a longer period of time. It's almost like, who cares? Who cares about deficits at all? Who cares about some of these rules? This sequester was an attempt, several years ago that we would set the money aside, and if you didn't cut it down, they had automatic cuts. That is gone. That is gone. They've eliminated that, and they say we won't even talk about the debt limit in 2 years. And besides, we have some set-asides. We're going to set things aside and help pay for this later on. But guess what? The set-asides are 10 years from now. So it's all a joke. And people will have to buy into it because it's done deliberately, and most of the major media are very closely aligned with the establishment, the deep state, and the military. So they're certainly not going to cut any military. The progressives have essentially given up on cutting and cutting back on militarism. So it is a philosophy of government intervention in all areas. Tragedy is it's very bipartisan. So people want and desire bipartisanship, and that is okay if the groups of people come together for one thing, and that is reduce the size and scope of government, design a system then to promote the cause of liberty, look to the rule of law, and set, as was set out as an example with our Constitution, bipartisanship and coming together and working together would be a good idea. But that's not what they were talking about this past week. They're talking about bipartisanship, so nobody says a word about the disaster awaiting us. And we cannot look at this without giving serious consideration to the monetary system, to the Federal Reserve, and how the deep state has an influence on the Federal Reserve, and philosophically they endorse this in all the universities. So that is what's necessary, because none of these bills could be paid for if they relied on taxation. But if we delay it and tax people by destroying the value of money, of course we can make one group suffer more than the other, and the people in charge, they don't seem to suffer quite as much. They need exposed, and the deep state is very influential and works very closely with the Federal Reserve. That exposure, just the exposure and understanding of this, would do a lot for us to move in the direction of designing policies that would promote peace and prosperity. I want to thank everybody for tuning in today to the Liberty Report. Please come back soon.